Hi, everybody. Welcome. My name is Lauren Mancia. I'm a professor in the history department at Brooklyn College and the Wolf Faculty Associate this academic year. And welcome to our panel on the Subaltern Archive. And welcome to Brooklyn College. Brooklyn College is a college that sits on the traditional and unceded territory stolen from the Canarsie and the Nyack, subgroups of the Lenape people, and that ongoing theft, along with the stolen blood and work of enslaved Africans, enables our presence today. Today, we are going to discuss how academics, historians, and students can find and listen to the voices of more marginalized people in historical societies. In academic discourse and post-colonial theory that emerged during the process of 20th century decolonization, the word subaltern refers to colonial populations who were and sometimes still are socially, politically, culturally, economically, and geographically excluded from the hierarchy of power in an imperial colony. Today, our panelists are going to explain how we can recover the voices of these people, especially when historical archives are also more often products of imperial elites and the victors of history, rather than more marginalized subaltern historical figures. So each speaker will speak for 7 minutes, and then after they speak, we'll open the floor and the chat for questions and comments and conversation until we end at 12:15. So our first speaker is Gunja Sengupta, professor of history at Brooklyn College and the Cuny Graduate Center. Take it away, Gunja.
All right. Can you hear me now? Fantastic. Big thank you to the Wolf Institute, Lauren, and welcome to Lisa Lowe, our guest speakers, our students, our audience for being here. I'm absolutely delighted to join you. So let me start by sharing with you what I mean by subaltern history in my own teaching and research. I teach and write, among other things, about the comparative histories of slavery and freedom in the North Atlantic and Indian Ocean worlds. Historians have shown how the power relations that produced slavery archives, like plantation journals, for example, set the stage for epistemic violence, right? Because these archives distorted enslaved subjects in ways that for too long were reproduced in professional history writing. But then about 6 decades ago, there was a revolution in US historiography shaped by protest movements of the 1950s and 1960s. Scholars expanded the boundaries of the traditional archive in order to capture historically marginalized voices. Historians of slavery, for example, read slave narratives, oral histories of enslaved peoples created during the 1960s. They sought to decode meanings embedded in cultural productions by the enslaved, like spirituals, folktales, and so on. But what if you don't have access to sources produced by the enslaved themselves? How do you make the subaltern speak? Now, I confronted this problem of sources while working on my forthcoming book. In this book, among other things, enslaved women's freedom flights flesh out for us the interface among the personal, domestic, and international politics of slavery and freedom in the North Atlantic and Indian Ocean worlds during the 19th century. These worlds were knit, right, by the blood and toil of human chattel into international networks of trade and travel and conquest and colonization and politics and ideology, culture and community. But they were also deeply divided over slavery and abolition, and an imperial power, as we know, loomed over these divisions on the high seas. And I'm talking, of course, about the British Empire, which saw anti-slavery diplomacy, at least partly, as a way to secure the moral and material foundations of imperialism. But for the historian, imperial abolition produced an infrastructure calculated to write the enslaved quite explicitly into the official documentary record as beneficiaries of a benevolent empire. Now, this infrastructure consisted of police stations and reports like this one. It consisted of depositions, law courts, cruisers, and so on. It was when the enslaved crossed realms of contention over slavery, whether political, legal, jurisdictional, that their voices entered the official archives that influence history making. And so we can read the structures, languages, and symbols of Britain's anti-slavery diplomacy, both along and against the grain. And by doing this, we can study the ways in which the marginalized use these resources to define meanings of freedom, to assert their claims to mobility, security against poverty, violence, community, and so on. So let's take a few examples from the Indian Ocean, where I tracked the circulation of enslaved African, Middle Eastern, and South Asian women among nodes of commercial exchange from East Africa through the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf into the Indian subcontinent. There, narratives of slavery are, of course, intertwined with imageries of the Oriental harem, right? But when these women in their various roles as captive, rebel, refugee, crossed borders of jurisdictional difference over slavery, they generated testimonies that transformed them from slave statistics into names and places, from objects of imperial benevolence into witnesses and mediators among powerful men like sultans and merchants and imperial bureaucrats. For example, look at this deposition, right? I used this to write about enslaved women who scaled the walls of the Mughal palace in Delhi in 1828 and claimed the protection of a British colonial office. Now, the king's son claimed them as concubines, but the women said that they had been independent shopkeepers. They were kidnapped, sold into slavery, and mistreated as domestic workers. In this instance, of course, they had to convince the imperial bureaucrats that they didn't have sexual or marital relations with anyone in the palace in order to be freed. But their testimony serves to resolve this dispute over slavery between powerful figures, colonial officials, and the Mughal king, right? Now, in this next petition, women rescued by the British from a royal zenana in Oman and brought to Bombay don't want to go back to their Arab enslavers. I don't know whether you can read these words, but for them then, freedom is not really a liberal, individualistic impulse for autonomy under the aegis of an anti-slavery empire. Why? Because they come from a system in which slavery functions as a way to expand kin groups. Enslaved concubines have some prospects for social inclusion in the master's community. And so they prefer returning to the zenana to becoming, let's say, an indentured worker in a British colony. From the Atlantic perspective, of course, this is crazy because these circumstances muddied the lines between market and family, between master and slave. What these examples suggest is that the colonial archives can also be read for differing subaltern relationships with the colonial state, right? And in this case, this range of relationships, subaltern relationships with the colonial state, offers a method for exploring comparative slavery histories. Did I make 7 minutes?
Very nice. Thank you, Gunja. We're going to move on now to Professor Lisa Lowe, who is our Hess Scholar in Residence and the Samuel Knight Professor of American Studies at Yale and our guest of honor this week. So Professor Lowe, take it away.
That was an exemplary talk with so many rich concepts. I'm so honored to follow you, Professor Sengupta. For my recent book, which considered the relations between the British abolition of transatlantic slavery, the introduction of Chinese indentured labor into the West Indies, the British East India Company's trades in India and China, and then also the rise of British and European liberalism, I worked in a variety of archives, state archives like the British National Archives that include Colonial Office, War Department, India Office, and parliamentary papers, but also with literature, essays, pamphlets, material culture, and other kinds of forms. In most cases, this means engaging with institutions like the British Library, the British National Archives, the Victorian Albert Museum, National Archives of Trinidad and Tobago, special collections at various universities. Of official archives, I was always concerned to ask, which interests, which authorizing state, agency, library, party, or office had constituted them? And how does a collection advance the interests of the state? Or do they uphold a particular concept of history, knowledge, citizenship, or polity? What does the official archive presume and naturalize? The colonial theft or occupation of land, slavery and the ownership of human beings? And how do we trace the connections between different colonized, enslaved, and coerced communities from a single official archive? Like Professor Sengupta, I found that interpreting official government documents in national archives often meant reading not only for what they conveyed, but also for how. Reading for absences, ellipses, conspicuous misinformation. In most cases, it also required reading across disparate archives, different canons, different locations, and linking objects or areas customarily treated as independent or separate. In other cases, it meant introducing informal materials like textiles, paintings, home furnishings, photographs. Whether National Archives, parliamentary records, or colonial office papers, or ships' logs, plantation accounts, immigrant labor contracts, I found that I could not treat the archives in which certain lives are presumed while others are foreclosed as stable or transparent collections of facts. And so I regarded the documents as themselves technologies of governance for knowing, administering, and racializing people, as well as evidence of the contradictions in national, colonial, and imperial projects. So the vast collections of the British National Archives hold the papers of the Colonial Office, the Foreign Office, the Slave Trade and African Department, the War and Colonial Department. And there are also separate series of records of each territory and colony in the empire, within which there are divisions for administering the regions. So in my book, I comment that in a way, we could think of the archive's different offices and departments as rooms of an imperial state. And as a material bureaucracy of rule, but also the historical record of imperial activities. The archive permits us to see how governance is strategic, permeable, and also an improvisational process. That is, the collection of tables and records and reports, the copied and recopied correspondences between offices. These are actively enacting, recording, but also producing the problems and uncertainties that were the conditions of imperial rule. As much as these documents comprise the very media of colonial administration, they also give us a sense of what colonial bureaucracy did not and could not know. Its incoherence, its fallibility, even as the offices perform the agency of an imperial will to know. I should say, with respect to the title of our discussions, that my work isn't strictly speaking concerned with subaltern archives, but rather in reading colonial or imperial state archives, both along and against the grain, in both Walter Benjamin and Ann Stoller's senses. That is, reading, on the one hand, the totalizing imperial ambition that the documents explicitly announce and perform, but also paying attention to absences, elisions, and equivocations that indicate the contradictions within the victors and their imperial statements, which give us clues to the historical presence and material force of the enslaved and the colonized, who may not have voices that are represented in the archives. So I noticed the aporia, the gaps, the discrepant tones, the insistent repetitions, and remarked on anomalies, tensions, and outright illogic. I'm going in with what remains. I'm going to offer an example of my approach to reading the archive. And I didn't create a slide because in the interest of time, So I want to give an example of how I read the archive, both for what it explicitly says, as well as for what it might obscure. So for example, there's an 1803 secret memorandum from the British Colonial Office to the chairman of the Court of Directors of the East India Company, in which colonial administrators outlined a plan to import, quote, the free race of Chinese to work in the West Indian island of Trinidad, to, quote, provide security against the spirit of insurrection being excited amongst the Negroes in our colonies, since the events which have recently happened in San Domingo and the establishment of a Negro government in that land. Of course, they're referring here to the Haitian Revolution. Continuing the quote, no measure would so effectually provide a security against this danger as that of introducing a free race of cultivators into our islands, who from habits and feelings could be kept distinct from the Negroes, and who from interests would be inseparably attached to the European proprietors. The Chinese people unite the qualities which constitute this double recommendation. So, unquote. So, let me just add here that throughout the first part of the 19th century, there were numerous shipments of Chinese indentured laborers. But the Chinese, in fact, ended up being much more unruly than this fantasy here projected, and that the British eventually imported many more South Asian indentured laborers because they were, of course, a direct colonial power in India. So after centuries of the British Atlantic slave system, this British plan to import Chinese workers appears to mark a significant shift in the management of race and labor in the colonies. The experiment with a differently racialized group, a, quote, free race who could be kept distinct from the Negroes, unquote, framed Chinese labor as a solution to both the colonial need to suppress Black rebellion and the desire to expand production. Many historians have explained the end of slavery in the Americas throughout the 19th century as a response to humanist arguments in Britain, France, Spain, and the US about the immorality of slavery. And they represent abolition and emancipation as ending slavery and establishing free modern societies. But putting this memorandum in relation to other archives on the British decision to end the slave trade in 1807 and slavery in its empire in 1834, or West Indian planters' correspondence and memoirs about the waning profits on sugar plantations, it's possible to see British abolition as a pragmatic attempt to stave off Black rebellion on the one hand, and to resolve difficulties in the sugar economy resulting from the relative inflexibility of enslaved labor within colonial mercantilism on the other. This description of the Chinese laborer as quote unquote free enabled planters to derive benefits from what's been called the quote transition from slavery to free labor, unquote. Conditions that in effect were not the end of unfree labor, but included a range of intermediate forms of coerced labor, from rented slaves and sharecroppers to convict labor to day laborers, debt peonage, and workers paid by task, as well as indentureship. So the Chinese were instrumentally used in this political discourse as a figure, as a fantasy of freedom, but still a racialized and coerced worker at a time when freedom was really unavailable to the enslaved and the indentured alike. In other words, categories of freedom were opportunistically and uneven. This connects with Professor Sengupta's talk very much. Freedom was opportunistically and unevenly used to manage the labors of racially differentiated peoples. In order to understand these relations and connections, it was necessary to read other materials alongside what was explicitly said in this 1803 memo, to read work on plantation slavery in the West Indies, English parliamentary debates over the abolition of slavery, liberal treatises touting free labor, and documents from the post-emancipation period, including contracts for the Chinese indentured laborers themselves. Among the other convergences I considered was the conjunction of the British 1834 Act that legally ended slavery with the termination of the East India Company monopoly in China and the commencement of liberal free trade. as well as which laid the groundwork for the British to become a global maritime power, as well as the conjunction of the governance of post-Opium War treaty ports in China and the colonization of Hong Kong with the massive emigration of Chinese labor and the expansion of the Manchester cotton industry that depended upon raw cotton and slave labor on plantations in the US South. So in conclusion, I found it necessary to read both with and against the grain of the documents I found in the official archives, and also importantly to read across different archives, combining unlike texts, objects, scales, and operations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Lowe. We're now going to move on to Professor Raquel Otheguy, who is Assistant Professor of History at Bronx Community College. Take it away, Professor Otheguy.
Thank you, Professor Mancia. There we go. Can you guys hear me okay? Great. So thank you to Professor Lauren Mancia and to Professor King for inviting me to be on this panel. And thanks to Mr. Anthony Bianco for all of his coordinating efforts. Welcome to Professor Lisa Lowe. Welcome to Cuny. I'm coming to you guys from Bronx Community College, and it's an honor for me to be at Brooklyn College. So thank you especially to the faculty and to the students at Brooklyn College for being here today. So today I want to talk to you about my efforts to recover the long and often ignored legacy of Black Cuban women in the creation of a Cuban educational system in the 19th century. These Black Cuban women teachers were pioneers in creating schools that were free to students, racially integrated, and that educated girls as well as boys. So the story of Cuban public education usually begins in the early 19th century with white Creole liberal reformers like white men associated with the Sociedad Económica de Amigos del País. These men, when it comes to education, wanted to create a modern educational system, which meant they wanted to create more primary schools to disseminate education more widely, but they wanted those schools to be for white children, or at least to be racially segregated. They wanted those schools primarily to be for boys, or if they had school for girls, those would also be separate schools. And they wanted the schools to be free to students because they were either paid for by the men of the Sociedad or other charitable organizations, perhaps religious organizations. And this issue of free primary education was the major issue for education reform around the world in the early 19th century. And those of us who went to public schools of the US are familiar to this, right? Probably if you went to a public school, it was free because it's paid for by the government. Inadvertently, these men and their priorities showed me that the history of education in Cuba should actually start with Afro-descended women, whose educational values would become the hallmarks of public education systems 100 or 200 years later, especially in the aftermath of Black liberation and civil rights movements. The records left by these white liberal Creole reformers from the early 19th century are filled with complaints about escuelitas de amigas run by what were called maestras amigas. These escuelitas de amigas were small schools similar to a daycare or a preschool, maybe a kindergarten, that were located in women's homes. And the teachers were mostly women of color. They were mostly Afro-descended women. And for just a quick note, in the 19th century, for most of the 19th century, Cuba is a slave society. So most Black and Afro and mulatto women in Cuba are enslaved, but there were also a lot of free women of color in Cuba. In these schools, the maestras amigas taught what was called primeras letras, which is basic reading, writing, counting, and often catechism. Perhaps the most interesting thing about these escuelitas de amigas is that they were mixed sex and they taught a lot of girls. This was something that was noted. This was a period when girls were not receiving a lot of education anywhere. They were mixed race, so there was Black and white children in the same classroom. And they were often free to students who couldn't afford even the meager tuition that the maestras amigas would charge to the neighborhood children. So in the archive, the white Cuban men particularly noted and lamented the racial mixing of these schools. You had Black teachers and you had white and Black students. Antonio Bachilleri Morales was a Sociedad member involved in the educational efforts, who complained that in the early to mid 19th centuries, these escuelitas had children of all colors mixed in the same classroom, and that they were taught by people of color who were, quote, the most debased and ignorant race teaching the Caucasian. All of this mixing, he said, fomented, quote, moral corruption. Okay, so notice in this quote, right, we have a white Creole man who's interested in creating an educational system in the liberal modern model, right? You're disseminating education widely, they're free schools. And at the same time, he's also discursively creating understandings about the links between race, gender, and knowledge or ignorance. In other words, in this case, as in the case that Lowe highlights in her presentation and in her book, Intimacies of Four Continents, the building of an important modern institution went hand in hand with building notions of who was capable of teaching and learning. In other words, making schools went hand in hand with making white supremacy. Okay, the Sociedad records also show me that maestras amigas were providing free schooling, which again is a major issue. For example, in an 1830 memoria, or kind of yearbook, the Sociedad members noted that there were 12 schools free of tuition in Havana, and these were run by either the Sociedad or again, another charitable organization or a municipality. And then as an aside, they say there were 17 escuelitas amigas that were also free of tuition, right? It's an aside, and yet there were more free tuition-free schools that were escuelitas amigas than there were by the white men. So despite the Sociedad thinking that they were the enlightened modern ones creating a modern school system because of free schooling, it was actually Black and mulatto women who were at the forefront of the free education movement in Cuba in the 19th century, which was the defining issue of public education and part of a wider Atlantic circulation of liberal ideas about mass primary education in this period. So on the one hand, Black Cuban women were ahead of the white men in creating free education. On the other hand, they challenged the educational model of white Creole reformers in other ways. So the maestras amigas had the schools in their homes. And so they're combining domesticity with schooling. This challenges the white liberal Creole model of what a modern education system should be. A public education system should be out in the public, right? Outside of the domestic sphere. And it would create a Cuban public, which for the Sociedad members were white males. But the education that the maestras amigas was providing was often racially integrated, co-educational. They were particularly noted for educating girls, and it was perhaps more free and widely available than the free education and mass education being offered by other parties in Cuba. In other words, Black Cuban women's educational values would turn out to be path-breaking and avant-garde as ideas of co-education, racial integration, and tuition-free education would become hallmarks of national public school systems later, throughout the 19th and 20th century. So the maestras amigas continue their work well into the 20th century, but they're not very easy to trace. When they do show up in the archive, it's in the vein of the two examples I gave you. Either white men are complaining about their race and their gender, or they're kind of an aside in the official record keeping. But the work of scholars like Lisa Lowe, or for example, that of slavery scholars like Marisa Fuentes, have taught me that what I need is not more pieces of evidence from the archive, but in fact, to pay certain kinds of attentions to the fragment in the archive and to how the archive is made. So Marisa Fuentes talks about, quote, using known biases in the archive to ask seemingly impossible questions about subjects whose presence, when noted, is distorted. She calls this methodology reading along the bias grain. And Lowe also, as you guys just heard, calls her methodology a reading practice in which we pay attention to that which is absent or deemed insignificant in combination with understanding the logic of the colonial archive. The creation of the public school system by white Creole activists in early 19th century Cuba not only tried to push maestras amigas out of the educational system, but also created actively a narrative that ignored their contributions and made a priori assumptions about the relationship between race, gender, and knowledge. And yet it is possible to use the same archive to reconstruct something of the perspective, knowledges, and values of these women. in closing, for the students out there, I would just want to share that what Professor Lowe and other scholars have taught me to do, and what is the same thing that I and your other professors are trying to teach you to do, right? When thinking about the past and the present, when it comes down to it, is just about asking questions, especially about power, and reading with a certain approach. We do this as professional historians, but you guys also do this in your classes, sometimes when you do the reading. So at the end of the day, we're all in the same boat. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Otheguy. All right, next up is Professor Louie Fishman, Associate Professor of History at Brooklyn College. Take it away, Professor Fishman.
Okay, great. Today I'm going to be doing something a bit different. Usually I do work in archives. I work in Ottoman Archives, where also I uncover many petitions of peasants, different groups that they do not send it to their local administrators. They send it directly to Istanbul in fear that they're going to be hidden or discarded. So this fear of the administrators is very important. I think what's important, just a note about the Ottoman Archives, and I'll move on to my quick talk today, is that we're not talking about an imperial colonial power. We're talking about a Ottoman country or state. They call themselves an Ottoman state, that they are not the other. They see themselves as the same often, whatever that means. So I think that adds a twist to what we're talking about. Today I'm looking, this is, first of all, thanks so much, Lauren, for inviting me to this. It actually saved me because I've been recently going more looking at remnants of the past, of communities that no longer exist in areas of the former Ottoman lands. So what am I doing here? So my question for today is, how do states memorialize and historicize the buildings and sites of the non-existent, marginalized other, the dispossessed in history, who were once communities that were not marginalized, but were central to the areas where they once lived. They were at one time an integral part of the social regional makeup. That is, until nationalist movements otherized them and created them into what I would call, in this case, subaltern societies. Important, this happens in the absence of a colonial power, but rather this has been done by nationalist movements. And for our purpose, I can ask, how do remnants of the past, these communal buildings, serve as a subaltern archive? How can we rethink them as occupied spaces, essentially colonized by non-imperial national movements, erasing and constructing new memories in place of them? The other question is, how is the memory of groups ethnically cleansed, or following ethnic cleansing, or subjects of semi-forced encouraged migration? How are they able to reclaim the past through these buildings? Now, in this work, it's an ongoing work for at least a decade. I finally got an article out that's being published this year just on the Jewish community. But in this work, I look at the historian Pierre Nora's understanding of the sites of memories. According to Nora, a lieu de mémoire is, quote, any significant entity where the material, non-material nature, which by dint of human will or work of time has become a symbolic element of the memorial heritage of any community. The process of transforming holy sites into museums and cultural centers empty of a living community highlight how a multiplicity of narratives emerge surrounding these sites and memories. So quickly, before I get to the pictures, in my work, I've been showing how the state sets out to create a multicultural present through the reconstruction or the invention of a cosmopolitan past. These sites can serve as an integral part of its national heritage. That's the same national heritage that actually ethnically cleansed them. However, for the communities that once housed these holy sites, the narrative which emerges can be a painful one of a lost past, or a narrative linked to memories of genocide, destruction, or oppression. So this summer I was able to, thankfully to a PSC Cuny grant, go to Crete, Western Turkey, and look at former Muslim sites in Crete, former Greek Orthodox sites in the Western Aegean area, and to look at the Jewish sites that I already documented and worked on. This is part of a greater project to understand better the memory of Palestinians and the Nakba within the Israeli sphere or space, occupied spaces. So this is because I'm sort of arguing now, I'm trying to develop that it's actually a model. Israel was actually modeled after these partitions, separations, and expulsions of population, which of course also enters the sphere of India and Pakistan as well, that has the colonial past there. So quickly, these are just some of the pictures I took. This is in Rethymno, Heraclius in Crete. This was a former mosque that's now a church. And like many, what we're starting to see is that whether it's in Greece, whether it's in Turkey, whether it's in Israel, dealing with the Palestinian past, often buildings are transformed, religious sites are transformed from one of the past to the other. Here in this one, there's almost no memory or no remnants of the past. There was only one. There is the mihrab, the direction of prayer, that's inside, but it's pushed to the side. You can't even get a good picture to it. And there was one Star of David. People don't know that the Star of David was also used in mosque for decorations. So there is one small Star of David, but here it's a mosque. And of course, they claim that before it was a mosque, it really was a church. So you see inside the church itself. This is in Rethymno. This is you see the remnants of the Ottoman past, the Muslim past, through the scriptures that are in Arabic characters. Now, oddly enough, the Turkish national movement also stripped Turkey of or transformed the language and transformed it into Latin characters. So also in Turkey, the Ottoman past is otherized as well. That's very, very important to point out. It's just not in Crete and places that you had now had a Greek national movement. The Turkish national movement also otherized the Ottoman past. So this is the entrance to a library, which is now a concert hall, which is right next to a mosque. So the mosque itself is also a concert hall. I wasn't able to get in this time because of COVID. I was there like 3 years ago. Then you see, of course, old fountains, Ottoman fountains in the city of Rethymno. Now, interestingly enough, you also have questions of gentrification happening in all these areas and this is a place where Greeks took over this old building. For 17 years, it's been an occupied space by protesters, refusing that a hotel should be built there. We see this also within the Turkish sphere of Istanbul, where occupied spaces often are fought over between protesters and governments. And it's inclusive here is the memory of the past group that used to live there. In this case, the mosque is literally about 20 feet away from here. And here is the mosque. The mosque, like in Turkey, they're used as museums. This mosque, I was not allowed to take pictures inside of it. It was a Greek nationalist art exhibit that had, heroic pictures painted of Turks being basically killed in the war and Greeks coming out victorious. They strictly made no pictures were allowed in there. It had nothing to do with the art itself, but much more about not getting that memory out and showing, maybe causing controversies. Now in Istanbul, this is not part of this is part of my urban research. I'm looking more regional within the Turkish sphere. And this is a new mosque that was built across from Gezi Park protest. This area used to be completely Greek. And we have a church right next to it, and this is larger than the church itself. So this is the idea of occupying spaces continues over 100 years after, exactly 1923 marks the founding of the Turkish Republic, so that occupying space. And once again, using this as archives, we can go and we can look through this. We see remnants everywhere of the past, but these remnants are being erased over time, or they're being preserved. And let me real fast, be preserved into new buildings and synagogues that are being funded by the state. So we have state projects to revive the memory, whether it's Armenians, whether it's Christians, Greek Orthodox, or whether it's Jews, which is really, really interesting. Now, once again, I said that the state does this as to reconstruct a cosmopolitan past. And they do not always include the voice of the other. For example, Jewish synagogues are turned into community centers, while the churches are often turned into museums. The difference is that the Armenians, when it's turned into a museum, they cannot pray there. They can only pray once a year with permission of the state. On the other hand, recently our Armenian church was open and they transformed it to a community center. We also see the differences between state and municipalities. Municipalities often revive the memory in a very different way, and I argue it's out of just wanting to learn the past and really trying to remember the past. Now, this past is often, the synagogue next to it is now now a school for teaching carpet weaving. And it's very important that people there realize that this used to be a synagogue. Now, the archives really get Subaltern archives is when you go to, now remember the Jewish community here, it wasn't forced, it wasn't ethnic cleansing in the sense that they were forced out, but it was encouraged migration by pogroms that happened other places in the 1934. And just as heavy taxes hit them, discriminatory taxes, many of them went to Palestine, and they become part of that whole conflict. But we see a cemetery on the side of a road, the right side of the road, and here we really get into Subaltern archives because we have names, places. Now the churches, this is a former church that is now a museum in Ivlik, Western Aegean coast. I'm just going to end here by explaining something. Here's another church that wasn't remodeled, right? That's in the midst of being, and in fact, people graffitied on it, time to knock it down. Some nationalists, I imagine, wrote time to knock it down, enough being here. And if we go here, this is my last person. He is one of 3 Jews left in the city of Çanakkale, and he is very popular for his Jewish type pastries, and people come in there. So he's one of the last people there. So when I talk about marginalized communities, oppressed communities, archives, we have to remember that still in some of these places, you have live people, but it's really a generation that's passed, and it's going to be through these remnants that we remember them today. So I'll go ahead and stop there. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Professor Fishman. We are now going to move to a real live archivist. Professor Colleen Bradley Sanders is associate professor and the college archivist at Brooklyn College. Students, you might not know that Brooklyn is the only CUNY school with its own archive. So Professor Bradley Sanders, go for it.
Actually, that's not true. There are several that do have archives. We're the only ones with the conservation lab. That I will brag about. Okay, so let me share my screen here. Okay. In 1970, historian Howard Zinn challenged archivists to do a better job of documenting the lives of ordinary people, to expand their collecting beyond the traditional focus on official records and important people. That challenge inspired an overwhelmingly white profession to begin more actively seeking out such records, including ones that would document the lives of women and religious and ethnic minorities. It's now 51 years since Zinn's challenge was issued. How have we done? There are some excellent archival programs that came into being after Zinn's speech. Centro, the Center for Puerto Rican Studies at Hunter College, was founded in 1973 and is the only university-based research institute devoted to the Puerto Rican experience in the US. The Iowa Women's Archives, established in 1992 at the University of Iowa, documents the lives of Iowa women, Latinx, African American, Jewish teachers, activists, homemakers, and more. Emory University's Rose Library began to acquire African American collections in the mid-1990s, excuse me, and now has the Robert Langmuir African American Photograph Collection, which contains over 12,000 images from the 1840s to the 1970s. Archive Grid is an excellent place to start a search for a collection. It's a free search engine that contains records of archival collections from over 1,400 institutions, not just in the US, from around the world. They have a total of over 7 million records. The Southeast Asian Archive at the UC Irvine Library, one of several across the country with a focus on Asia, was established in 1987. If you type in Southeast Asian Archive into the archive grid, you pull up 427 records, not all of which are specifically collections focused on Southeast Asia. If you go to the summary view of this search, you can you can sort your results. You can look at individual people, a name of an archive or an institution, a place, a topic, such as Vietnamese Americans. Source that aggregates information about archival collections is the Directory of Ethnic and Multicultural Archives and Special Collections, which seeks to make it easier to discover collections relevant to your research. If we clicked on the Herbert Jenkins Photographs collections, we would come to this page. And this page tells you about the collection, what institute it's located at, and it also provides a link to the collection guide or finding aid. You'd have to click on the Herbert Jenkins Photographs name. And then if you clicked on that, you would come to this. This is the guide to the collection. On the right-hand side of the screen, under the collection organization section, if you clicked on any one of those links, that would take you to a more detailed description of that entry, maybe a folder inventory of that, what constitutes that entry. Say the Herbert Jenkins portraits might be 4 folders of material. The Interference Archive is a volunteer-run archive that opened in 2011 in Brooklyn, and it contains tens of thousands of items created as part of social movements around the world. Unlike most archives, the stacks are open to researchers, and the archive has publications, a study center, public programs including exhibitions, workshops, talks, and screenings of audiovisual materials, all of which seek to encourage critical and creative engagement with the rich history of social movements. Now, Howard Zinn was not the initiator of collecting underdocumented groups, but he did think we could do more and better. There are some longstanding and superior collections devoted to African American history, including the New York Public Library's Schomburg Center, Howard University's Moreland Springer Research Center, and the Vivian G. Harsh Collection at the Chicago Public Library, each of which were founded many decades before Zinn's speech. There's also the Latin American Library at Tulane University, which dates to 1924. The library collects, preserves, and provides access to historical and contemporary resources on Latin America, the Caribbean, and diasporic communities. One of the highlights of their archive is the William E. Gates Collection, which contains rare books and manuscripts from the earliest years of Spanish rule in Mexico to the Mexican Revolution in the 1910s. These are just a few examples of archives devoted to underdocumented groups. I think the profession has responded fairly well to Zinn's challenge, but there's one area in which it definitely falls short: recruiting people of color to the profession. I don't know what the demographics of the archival world were in 1970, but you can see from this slide that the profession remains heavily white. I'm not sure what the answer is to changing those statistics, but that's probably another discussion anyway. Now, for Brooklyn College, the primary mission of the Brooklyn College Archives is to document the history of the college. We also focus somewhat on Brooklyn itself, broader Brooklyn. Thanks to the highly diverse student body at Brooklyn College, we should have a pretty diverse archival collection. We've got to start on that, but it's not as diverse as it could be. We can certainly do more. We do have a number of collections of women, both those with a connection to Brooklyn College and those without a connection. And we have a few significant collections of African American history, such as the papers of Reverend William Augustus Jones, Jr., and those of Shirley Chisholm, who is a Brooklyn College alum. In March of this year, we put the digitized sermons of Reverend Jones up on the college's digital repository. It's called Illumira. And this is a screenshot of that collection. So if you clicked on any one of those sermons, you would come to a page. The image on the left is the top of this page. You'd scroll down and see the rest of the image on the right. Basically, this page, in addition to the recording, gives you basic information about the recording. And if there is a transcript, which is one of our ongoing projects to create transcripts for these recordings, a link would show up here as an attachment to the collection. Some other collections at the Brooklyn College Archives that represent underdocumented groups include the YWCA of Brooklyn Papers, which document over 100 years of that organization's efforts to support and educate women, including minorities. The Brooklyn YWCA was the first in the country to integrate during World War II. The archives also holds the papers of Brooklyn College sociologists, Jerome Crace, who's retired, and I'm going to mangle this name, Setsuko Matsunaga Nishi. We have papers of the Chinese Language and Culture Club, the Hank Kaplan Boxing Archive, which is a treasure trove of information about minorities' participation in the boxing world. And then we have the Annie Smith Peck collection. She was a mountain climber in the early 20th century, kind of an oddity. Not all of our finding aids are online for Brooklyn College archives. So if you want to know what we have, please do, drop us a line at specialcollections@brooklyn.cuny.edu or come in. We are open Monday through Friday. In a panel discussion last year, I spoke about Rabia Gibbs's 2012 article in which she noted that despite 40 plus years, and that's almost 50 now, of mainstream archivists making efforts to diversify the profession and archival collections, there is still inadequate understanding of the historiography of ethnic archives, including those in African-American communities. Her main points were that in order to be successful in diversifying our archival collections, we must understand the original reasons collections were created and learn to recognize prejudices and standards for inclusion or exclusion within a given community. There may well be established standards of historiography for the groups we seek to document. So when mainstream archivists talk about diversity in the archives, we need to ask ourselves if we are following our own agenda or that of the selected community's self-determined criteria for what they want to preserve. And I will stop my share now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Bradley Sanders. Our final speaker, last but not least, is Professor Vivian Louie, who is Professor of Urban Policy and Planning and the Director of the Asian American Studies Program and Center at Hunter College. Welcome, Professor Louie.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation to be here with you today. I'm just honored. I'm honored to be on a panel with Professor Lisa Lowe, especially one that honors her work and her spirit. Of course, Professor Lowe is a pioneer in so many domains, including in Asian American studies. And I've been a big fan of her work from way back. And that also includes our Asian American Studies faculty. We're all big fans of her work. So as already mentioned, I'm the director of the Asian American Studies Program and Center here at Hunter College, which is the host to the largest Asian American Studies undergraduate program within Cuny. So in fall of 2020 through summer of 2021, Hunter's Asian American Studies taught 1,100 students. Hunter's Asian American Studies Center, which was launched in 2019, builds on this foundation with public programming and also opportunities for students. So I define subaltern as people whose voices are typically not heard, whose contributions are typically not seen. And these have included racial, ethnic, and religious minorities, and also working class and poor folks, women and gender and sexual minorities. So my past and current work, meaning my research, focuses on present day voices and present day stories, and including my latest book, which I'm writing, which focuses on Asian American civic participation. So all of that work fits in this terrain, but that's not what I'm going to talk about today. Today, I'm going to bring into the conversation efforts to bring in Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders into the curriculum and into broader learnings. So I'm going to bring into the conversation not only who appears in history, as important as that is, but also who learns that history. Because even when the voices of the subaltern are included in research, that does not mean that they're necessarily heard or seen. And that stymies change and the push for social justice. So what I'm going to say next, of course, is familiar to Professor Lowe because she's a pioneer in Asian American studies, but I'm aware that some of us are not as familiar, and that a lot of classes at Brooklyn College are part of the audience today. So what is Asian American studies and its relationship to social justice? Asian American studies is grounded in the idea that to understand America, we need to understand the experiences and contributions of Asian Americans, of all its peoples, and that working together is needed to build the common good, to build America and to move us forward. Who counts as an American? Under what conditions? How can Americans build coalitions with one another to fight for equality for all? All our Asian American studies courses at Hunter help us pose, think through, and answer those questions across different domains in history, civil rights and the law, public policy, the arts, diasporas. Now, before I move to the topic of what Asian American studies is and show some visuals, I want to say that our nation is at a critical moment with regards to Asian American studies and ethnic studies. And this really shouldn't surprise us, given the killing of George Floyd, given the resurgence of anti-Asian hate and so many hatreds. So just this month, California acted to require its K-12 students to learn about the contributions and struggles of Blacks, Latinos, Native Americans, and Asian Americans in our nation's history. This past summer, Illinois became the first state to require K-12 schools to teach Asian American studies. In New York State, Senators John Liu and Kevin Thomas, the first Asian Americans elected to the New York State Senate back in 2018, the first, along with several of their colleagues, introduced a bill that would require all New York State public elementary and high schools to teach the historical and civic impact of Asian Americans. And there's also a grassroots effort to the DOE to have Asian American history and culture taught in our public schools. I'm going to share my screen now. And yes, success. So what are these stories that have rarely been told? Corky Lee, the acclaimed photographer of Asian American life, whom we lost to COVID-19, liked to recount the story of how he came to his chosen calling, right? And it was because the Chinese immigrant men who helped build the Transcontinental Railroad, often doing the most dangerous and the dirtiest jobs, they were literally airbrushed out of photographic history, except for a few instances like this one. And then you can see in the middle, this is an artifact from the push of white working class labor to exclude Chinese immigrants from coming to the United States, which was successful. And then on the right is a photograph on the eve of the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. Now, this exclusion has not ended, as we've seen from the Atlanta and the Indianapolis shootings this past spring. So these lost and recovered histories, both past and present day, really inform the Asian American Studies curriculum and the skills that students learn. And that's because students need an historical lens to understand what's going on, how to make sense of it, how they can be agents of change. I also want to add that student supports and services are a big part of this story. A third of Hunter's undergrads are Asian American. And Hunter is an Asian American, Native American, Pacific Islander serving institution, or ANAPISI for short. And this is a federally supported program led by my colleague John Chin and Caitlin Ho, who directs it. All right. So Asian American Studies brings into the story the long overlooked history of exclusion and of Asian American pushback against that exclusion, including through our legal system. These are the contributions that people who are advocating want to be told, right? How Asian Americans have been at the forefront of landmark policies and Supreme Court rulings around birthright citizenship, around the right of English language learners to have supplemental supports in our nation's public schools, right? Pushback against rescinding naturalized citizenship on the basis of race, pushback against the racialized and religious profiling of Muslim Americans, Arabs, Sikhs, and South Asian Americans in the wake of 9/11, and also the 2017 travel ban. But research and public programming are also a part of this necessary education. And this is where Hunter's Asian American Studies Center, launched in 2019, enters the story. So both in the curriculum and in research projects, students learn about how change happens, right? And I just want to share that I often, I think this is important, so I am going to take a minute to talk about this. So I co-lead the Asian American Studies Hunter at Hunter College Oral History Project. It's a fantastic student community research partnership. And what I learned is that between 1974 to 1984, Drs. John Henry Clark, the founding chair of the Africana, Puerto Rican, and Latino Studies Department, and Tilden Lamel, who was also chair of that department, and then became Hunter's provost, vice president of academic affairs, and later acting president, that they both led critical support to having some Asian American studies content at Hunter College. Back then, it was just a single course. So this coalition building is critically important. And I'll just end by saying that public programming provides a birth to hear and to learn from these voices on a broader scale. So the Asian American Studies Center just hosted an event on Asian Americans, arts and activism, reflections from Curtis Chin, the award-winning writer and documentary filmmaker, and the acclaimed novelist Bino Rayulio. And they're two of the co-founders of the Asian American Writers Workshop, which really brought Asian American voices into the American literary canon. And next month, we are hosting Why BTS and K-pop Should Matter to Asian Americans with Grace Kao, the renowned sociologist, Asian Americanist, and colleague of Dr. Lisa Lowe at Yale University. And I'm going to stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Louie, for that impassioned ending. Love it. All right. So now the chat is open. The floor is open. We want to hear your questions, your connections, your thoughts, things you learned. Feel free to put your questions in the chat, to raise your hand by pressing reactions and the raise hand button in reactions. If you want to make connections between the talks that you heard or connections to something you're learning in class and the talks that you heard, or questions about how to do this kind of work, we are open to all of this. So feel free to put them in. Vivian, you need to put how the BTS meeting can be joined in the chat, the November event. Professor Fishman.
Yeah, first of all, thanks so much for the great presentations. And I was really seeing the archive, talking the archives and talking of archives. I'll just say that my research has radically changed by the opening up of newspapers online. So we're able to access so much information recently from, I do the early 20th century Ottoman Palestine. It's really it's a revolution how we understand. We have search engines we can find. The search engines you miss a lot of things that we used to have to read every individual paper. Now we can go and so whether it's about peasants, marginalized communities, of course you have to understand the direction of who's writing it, why they're writing it in the context. But we just have so much more access, I think, to information. And it's actually a bit overwhelming. I'll end with that. I don't know. I think the way history is going and the amount of newspapers online, it is overwhelming. And there's a lot out there to discover, and a lot of voices we haven't heard before are coming through these newspapers.
Cool. While we're waiting for other questions, if other panelists have questions for each other, feel free to put your name in the queue, but Angelina, go for it. Don't forget to unmute yourself.
Okay, hi. Sorry, I haven't done my hair yet, but we're here. So in high school, before coming into college, we learned that colleges have this percentage of diversity when you're looking into colleges, and how does that look? And so I wanted to know how having diversity as a positive aspect now affects the acceptance rates of different minorities going into college, and how have you guys seen it change over the time that you've been a professor? As well as, do people only get accepted for race now? Is this a thing? Like, that's my question.
Cool. Very practical. Any panelist can respond. I know that many of our panelists are historians who don't specialize in college admissions processes right now, and this might be one of the answers to Professor Bradley Sanders' demographics, right? One way to become an archive, right, to become an archivist, right?
Sure. Yeah, I taught one class, Intro to Archives, a few years ago, and we had I think one person. It was mostly history students. I think maybe a couple English, but one person of color in the class who actually was interested in becoming an archivist. And we do have a relationship with Queens College, which has a library school. And so we offer internships to any of the students there that need them. And so hopefully, giving them real world experience will encourage them to keep going and maybe join the profession.
Can I take a stab at answering Angelina's question? I don't have a direct answer, Angelina, but it is a fantastic question. What I can say is that, you guys are why we do our work, right? So I do think that having a diverse classroom, which is something that we tend to be pretty lucky about at Cuny. Lots of Cuny schools have very diverse classrooms. Having diverse students really pushes us to respond to what our students want. And so you guys should do, many of our students are very outspoken in telling us what they want to learn, but you should continue, and you should feel free to push your professors to teach you what you want to know. And my favorite question is always like when somebody gets bored and exasperated in my class and is like, why do I care about this? This sounds boring, because then it really makes me do my work of trying to convince you why I think what I'm doing is important, but also to make sure that I am representing history. I'm a history professor, a history that says something to you, that is useful to you. So I think that's the benefit of having a diverse classroom. There was something else I was going to say, but I can't think of it right now, so I'll stop.
May I just add to that? Yeah, I think that it's incredibly important to have a diverse student body when you consider that the impetus for fields like African American history, and now I do hope Asian American studies at Cuny and elsewhere, often comes from below, right? There's a direct connection between the academy and what happens in the world out there. So the civil rights movement, the women's movement of the 1950s, 60s, 70s had a great deal to do with the emergence of history from below. It was when people of African descent, it was when women entered the academy through universities in large numbers that we began to think of broadening the archive. So diversity is incredibly important for intellectual renewal, for asking new questions, for thinking about how to broaden our repository of raw materials for answering those questions. And so, yes, we can, and then the other fantastic question that Angelina asked was about race, right? Is it just about race? And I think this opens up, this connects directly as well to the fantastic presentations of Professors Lowe and Fishman and some of the others as well. You know, subaltern identities, I think we have to remember, are relational identities, right? We're talking about people who navigate the world at the intersection of different discourses of power. So race is mediated by gender, sexuality, sex. And so when we think about diversity, we have to think about these intersections. I think it's incredibly important to do that. And Louie worked the variables of time and place into and space into this relational definition of subaltern identity.
Professor Louie.
Thank you. I just actually have a question for Professor Lisa Lowe, if that's all right. I just wanted to ask Professor Lowe about her reflections of doing this work, you know, this important archival work of this subaltern for so many decades, and just your reflections. I would be so interested in learning about that.
Well, thank you for your fascinating presentation about Asian American studies at Hunter College. And it just, in relation to all of these amazing presentations about the gaps and absences of subaltern histories, it's really wonderful to hear about collections that have gathered up materials that are positive, affirmative records for people to consult. Well, I mean, again, this is kind of related. I just put my answer to the Angeline's question in the chat. And I think, you know, I suppose what's behind that, and also as an answer to your question, is that, you know, we have a long ways to go for universities to catch up with their missions to educate the public. Our publics are much more, quote unquote, diverse than we've even begun to make them, that make the university populations. And part of that, of course, is diversifying our archives and our collection processes, which Professor Bradley Sanders has discussed Brooklyn College is doing. It's providing new curricula, it's teaching new subjects, founding new departments, hiring new faculty. It's a wide variety of structural changes that you know, we probably should have done a long time ago. There were state interests in not doing it, elite interests in not doing it. So it's not as if it's a matter of sort of incompetence, it's a matter of interest in not changing. And so I think we need to be really skeptical of this idea that somehow now diversity is the rule and there's so many diverse students getting accepted to colleges because of their race. I think that's a real counterfactual discourse. Like many of the ones we've seen in the colonial archives, as a matter of fact. So anyway, your question is wonderful. I don't have a really good answer to it. I love teaching. I love connecting with students and sharing ideas, and that's really kept me through.
Great. Any other questions? There's some great conversation and comments happening in the chat, which is fantastic. But any other questions for our speakers? So we have a question in the chat, which is, how do you increase the archive holding? So many diverse stories and possibilities are out there. It was surprising to see the stats of white staff working at the archives. Do you bring in the communities? So I'll repost it in the chat so you all can see it, but that's for all of you.
Yes, I would say that you could do that, make an effort to outreach to the communities. Each archive should have a collecting policy on what they focus on. And as I said in my presentation, Brooklyn College's main mission, the archive's main mission, is the history of the college itself. But we do also collect material of interest to the borough of Brooklyn without competing with the Brooklyn Public Library's historic section, which is now merged with the Brooklyn Historical Society. But that's how we have the papers of Reverend Jones. He was the longtime pastor at Bethany Baptist Church in Brooklyn. And through Professor Linda Day, actually, his papers came to us. And we, you know, with connections like that or outreach of our own, the YWCA collection also, no connection to Brooklyn College, but the director of the YWCA reached out to someone who reached out to the archivist at the time, and that's how we ended up with that collection. So we are certainly, you know, open to working with community members to find an appropriate home for a collection. It may or may not be at Brooklyn College. For example, a Puerto Rican collection might be better off at Centro, even if it is a Brooklyn collection. It all depends.
What about these historical archives? I mean, like, do these archives that were started in like the 19th century that some of you were talking about add to their collections or diversify the voices, make an effort to diversify the voices in their holdings?
I guess, again, it would depend on the focus. For example, the Schomburg collection, which was not called that at the beginning, it began in the 1920s. Actually, it was a white librarian that started the collecting those kinds of materials. And I'm not sure about the Emory University one that started in the 90s, but for example, the Latin America one at Tulane was, again, you know, the interests of a person, I think, again, a white librarian who had an interest in that and sort of started doing that collecting. So a lot depends on the collection policy, the collection development policy for a given archive. And those can certainly be changed and updated to, if you want to diversify your collections more, certainly they can be updated and include new types of materials.
And Professor Lowe and Sengupta, Fishman, Otheguy, you know, many of you were speaking about these collections as sort of potentially holding the position of the state, holding the position of the empire, right? As the empire and the state change their position, do the archives change at all? I mean, I know the Ottoman Empire doesn't exist anymore, but you know, Professor Fishman, you were talking about nationalism affecting these monuments. Does it affect the archives, you know, et cetera?
I would say that absolutely. I mean, the interesting part of working in the 1920s, you know, I worked towards the end of the Ottoman Empire, it's the same people that were very emerging in the late Ottoman era. You know, they bridged the two periods. So yeah, their interest changed quite a bit from what they want to archive and how they archive also. And I think it's the Ottoman Archive. Ottoman Archive is interesting enough. Everything's almost handwritten still up until 1918. Almost everything is, or 1914. Everything's handwritten. So it's very difficult to. I mean, it's a lot of work. Once you come to the Republican period, everything's typed. Everything's, you know, by 1927 in Latin characters, much more easier accessible. And I would even say less so because it's more compact. But it does more of a Western idea of what archive might be. I imagine, I haven't worked extensively compared to the Ottoman archives, which includes just not Istanbul, but Palestine and the Balkans and different areas. Yeah, the focus is radically changed, but it's the same people working. And that, to me, that's very interesting.
And then, you know, think of the ex-enslaved narratives that were sponsored during the New Deal by the federal government here. So here you have an example during the New Deal of the federal government actually creating this treasure trove of materials for historians to revolutionize the study of slavery. So that can happen as well. But I would generally say that, you know, as Louie was making the point, go outside the brick and mortar archive, seek out these sources in unusual places. Think of the archive in the broadest possible senses if you want to capture these marginalized voices.
Lovely.
To add just one thing, it was exactly what Professor Lowe, you were talking about objects, as bringing in objects. So on one hand, you have a building, but object is also something, you know, tangible, you know, take it and you can understand it and how that use of that object has changed over time. I think that's essential. Like you said, get out of the brick and mortar. We have so much in the archives, so much online, but once you walk out, there's a whole world out there also.
Great. Well, I hope that these talks have inspired some of the students to read against the grain and read against the biased grain and read against all the grains that we talked about, and to continue to fight to have their voices heard in the classroom, to demand that their professors teach histories that matter to them and that speak to the representation of many, many different perspectives in those histories. And I hope we'll see you all today at 3:40 for Asian American writers from the MFA program, or tonight at 6:05 to talk about oral histories made by Brooklyn College students deposited in the Brooklyn College Archives. So it's a good part too. Thank you all so much, and a big round of applause again to everyone on our panel.